Welcome to today's Destination Unknown video. Today I wanted to take a minute to talk about tarot decks versus oracles. So a lot of times you'll see people who call a deck a tarot deck, and I'll look down at that deck that they're referencing and I will quickly realize that they're actually holding something that's not a tarot deck at all. What's the difference? If you're using cards for cartomancy, is there a difference at all? Yes, there's definitely a difference. And the difference is with tarot, you're going to have a certain structure, which is followed every time by the deck creators. So this structure we talked about in myth number 2. If you listen to the series, the podcast series, that one we talk a lot about how tarot came to be and the history of all the different decks in the process that became what we later now call a tarot deck. But for the purposes of today, the tarot deck, like I said, it follows a structure, which is 78 cards. And the 78 cards are always 22 major arcana cards and 56 minor arcana cards. And the cards themselves, this deck here is the first one I pulled for us to look at today. And this is an actual reprint of the Rider Tarot deck. So in the old days, that's what they called it, Rider instead of Rider-Waite or Rider-Waite-Smith. It's known by its cross-hatched back. That's another sign of these cards that you'll notice. And this is a reprint. You can tell not only the fact that they were true to some of the crudeness of the illustrations that were there from the originals, but they redid the titles. And this is a US Games thing. So this is a US Games reprint of the original illustrations. These illustrations themselves were then used and used again. So we talked about in one lecture how Rider-Waite and Rider-Waite-Smith clones came to be. So the clone decks that are all based off of the structure and the illustrations in the Rider-Waite deck, those are what you begin to see more of. So this one is called the Universal Waite deck. And I pulled this one specifically so you could have a side-by-side comparison of what the High Priestess card looks like. I'll get my fingers out of the way best I can. You can see the titles are also different. The newer one, which is also referencing older illustrations, and this one, the Universal Waite, it has a different back of card, and this one was re-illustrated. It was true to all the, obviously, the original illustrations by Pamela Coleman Smith, but they were recolored, watercolored, and kind of given a little bit more detail. And this particular deck, as I pull it out, is basically just that. So it's the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but it's a remake. It's a little bit more of a refined copy with the illustrations having a little bit more watercolor effect. You move forward with the Rider-Waite clones, and you begin to see other decks. I've set out a couple here that use the same concepts of the illustrations, but they put their own spin on it. This one in particular, do I have? Yes. Here's the box, the Tarot of the New Vision, an Italian deck. So this deck, in and of itself, you can see, just by looking at the box, their idea is to take the illustration and show you what is happening on the other side of the card. So here we see the traditional magician card, and here in their version of it, we see the same card, but the opposite view, what's happening to the opposite side. So that's kind of an interesting take. Here's a few of those cards, like the Fool card. And the Hanged Man is one that I wanted to talk about while talking today. You'll notice, so our Hanged Man here, the New Vision, is just like we said, it's an opposite version, or an alternative, I should say, version of what's happening in the traditional Hanged Man. The Hanged Man card itself, for me, is a make or break card. Some decks I cannot barely use because I really dislike how they handle either the Hanged Man the Devil card, and the Death card. Maybe even Tower, but those three in particular, those top three, those are doozies for me, because when those come up in a reading, and if you have an illustration that's not going to help you or is going to hinder you in some way of giving the message you need, what do you mean, Alyssa? Well, let's see. Let me grab here. I have another Rider-Waite-Smith clone. This is based on the Arthurian legends, right? It's a King Arthur style deck. So here we see the Universe card instead of the World card. But look at this. I put this right on top. Look at this Hanged Man. So they're taking the Hanged Man story and they're applying it to some of the Arthurian legends, which is an idea that I love. I'm an Arthurian buff. But as you can see here, this is legit a man hanging by his neck from a tree, which is not at all what this card is trying to convey in a reading. So when somebody sees something like this and you're trying to get them to the meaning of this, oh boy, that can be a long haul, and I've faced that before. But this deck in particular, it also has some crossover into another deck I'm going to show you, which is the Thoth. We talked about the Thoth in a couple podcasts as well. So the Universe card that came from the Arthurian deck, you can see how it has a similar design concept to the Universe card, which is in the Thoth. Now, this is a different deck. If you listen to the Tarot #2 myth, you'll know more about how this one came to be. Different illustrator, Lady Frida Harris, illustrated these. And they are using the same structure of tarot, so you have 78 cards again. The cards themselves, they're a little larger, and this is a traditional aspect to these cards. This is what the card backs look like traditionally as well. Lots of meaning behind that. We won't get into that. But in any case, very, very different style illustrations. There's the Chariot, by the way. But also some of these references in it do go back to the Rider-Waite. So there's a mixture of imagery happening in some of these decks as well. All right, moving forward, this deck is called the Shapeshifter deck. It's also based on, looks like a lot of them are upside down. I didn't write them all. I just keep my decks as I keep them. In any case, so this shows people shape-shifting in the cards, literally. So here's one of the lovers. Very pretty, very pretty. Anyway, very different deck, speaks differently. So people will talk about how their deck speaks to them and how the images inspire them while they're reading. This is something that's entirely personal. And so one of the important things when you're looking for a deck, I have had decks given to me. I set another one aside to show you that sometimes just don't speak to me. I can't find it in all the piles of decks all around me right now. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this one is also, it's a cross-hatched, very old-fashioned tarot deck that was given to me. It has more of the older-fashioned style of the pip cards that you see in the Marseille, where they're not fully illustrated like the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is. But also she did something really cute. She wrote in runes on all of her cards to give her some more meaning as she was reading, and I think it was also kind of a memory jogger for her. So hey, you know, this is a deck I have never read with. I probably never will. It's cute, and it was given to me by a friend, so I still have it. But it's kind of a great way to like encourage you. Your cards are your tools. You can do anything you want with them. People customize their cards all the time. And a common customization, while we're on the subject, and I'm looking at this deck, sometimes people will remove the borders from cards, and they prefer a borderless card. Those are really engaging. It almost feels like you're walking into that card. I have a Buckland Romney tucked away that I should dig out for another day. It's a very rare deck. It's now become a collector's item. When I bought it, it certainly wasn't. I just like the illustrations, and it's a borderless. Okay, so all of these decks that we have just looked at are all tarot decks. They look very different, but they follow the same structure. 4 suits of cards in the minors. You've got all of the numbered cards, the same 4 cards for the court cards themselves. all of that structure is adhered to, even though their take and their way of expressing that, what each of the cards mean, is unique to each illustrator and the authors of these decks. But that's all still tarot decks. What I'm about to show you now are oracle decks. So what's the difference? An oracle deck is one that does not follow the structure of 78 cards, 4 suits, majors and minors, major arcana, minor arcana. One of my favorite oracle decks is called the Fraud Fairies. It's the Fairy Oracle deck. Beautiful illustrations, and one that I really enjoy, have enjoyed working with over the years. It's not a tarot deck. Does that make it wrong? No. Is it less, is it devalued somehow as a tool, just like a tarot deck is a tool? No. You may find that there are times that your tarot is just not really motivating you. And as readers, we say, it's not, my decks aren't really speaking to me right now. And what we mean by that is the imagery has grown stale, or something about the process of reading we're not engaged in anymore. Sometimes going into a different path, if you're frustrated and you don't want to just give up reading, but you want something new, going into oracle decks can be a great way to push your intuition into new directions, because these are going to use a different, entirely made up by the author, by the publisher, by the illustrator, if they're not all the same people, and like the Fraud is, that is in particular going to help you move past some of the structure. So sometimes I've gotten stuck with my tarot card readings. I get very bogged down. I remember a few years into a lot of really heavy duty study, I started getting really bogged down with a lot of this, the meaning and the backgrounds of all the cards. And I just couldn't get the cards to talk to each other and then to understand how they were making one story come together. And sometimes pulling from different cards and different decks are going to give you different stories. Another reader that I have, a friend of mine, she reads with the Fraud, to go back to that one again. And one of the things, the characteristics about these cards is, as you can see in this one, there are many, many, many characters. And kind of the longer you look at it, the more faces and stories come up from the background of the card. And she would, in particular, it was her style to pull just one card to answer your question or to do your reading. And she would kind of talk to, air quote, she would go around and give messages from every single character within the card that she felt moved to express in her reading. This is a different one. Medicine cards is this one. So this is obviously speaking in a Native American imagery and working in a totally different way. It also has you draw your own card, which is cute. And the cards themselves, they're a lot more pared down than those Fraud Fairies we were just looking at. The imagery is much, you see how it's repeated, and there are differences in both of these dream catchers. So what are those differences? Finding those kind of moments in the card, as well as what the cards themselves, when you study following animal path and that sort of meditation and imagery, which this kind of work is great for, it's a different path entirely than a tarot reading. It's going to speak in a different way. It's going to answer a question in a different way. It's probably going to evoke questions for someone in a different way as well. So that's one style or two styles of oracle deck. There are a lot of oracle decks out there. I used to have even more decks in my own personal collection. I think at one point I had over 40 decks, which for a real correct collector, they're like, please, child's play. I have that many just in hand's reach away right now. So that's really not a lot, but I have pared down a lot because there were a lot of decks. I got to the point where I was collector. I just wanted more. And when you get that mania of collecting, the next bright shiny toy is the next one you want, whether it be a new issue or something that's hard to find and you just found out about it yourself and now you're obsessed with finding that old deck or rare deck. So yeah, there are a lot of decks out there. Only a few here that we're seeing today. This particular deck, I think it was called the Hidden Answer deck. Golly, it's been so long since I bought it, maybe 15-ish or more years ago. And I didn't keep the little white book. That'll be the last thing I talk about today. But you can see this one, for first, it's tiny. Holy moly, it's always a challenge trying to hold on to this deck because it is so small. And the illustrations themselves, they're all black and white. They kind of are very film noir, if you will, when I use them. And like that one, Jealousy, Bad News. So the way that they're titled, Stop, Look, Listen. The way that they're titled is going to lead to an entirely different reading. This one is fabulous. I loved using this deck. I went through a phase where I preferred this to tarot for a good while because I felt like it was speaking to me in just very clear, distinct messages. No messing around, no flowering, no trying to guess what actually is being said to me. I felt like I was very clearly getting the answers I needed when I was using this deck, so I got very close to it for a while. Okay, so that's the difference. That's what a tarot versus an oracle deck is. Now you know the difference. Neither is going to be better or worse, except in how you react to it. So if there's one that you prefer using, even if you go back and forth, that's okay. And as you know from Tarot Myth number 1, you are empowered to choose and buy your own deck. And if you don't know that yet, go back and listen to that one. It's a really fun podcast. Last thing we're talking about is the Little White Book, which is literally called the Little White Book. So sometimes a lot of these decks, at the same size of the card itself, they pack in a little white book of meanings, key meanings. So it'll go through and blah, 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 right? It's better than if you got nothing. And if you're just starting from nowhere and you don't know what's going on, there's your life raft. That was my first life raft. Some of the books themselves, this is the Shapeshifter Tarot that I was showing you earlier, have entirely not little white books, but they do come with a companion book, as it's also known, which are huge and fully fleshed out and have lots to tell you about every single card. So these can also, it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to dig in to a book, be it big or small, or if you want to start that process like we talked about in journaling, where you just have your own dialogue and you come to your own associations. I have the last one to show you today is the book that goes with the Froud. Those are the fairies that we were just looking at. And in this particular deck, it comes with a gorgeous, really big book, lots of information from the illustrator creator himself about how these images came to be and how they speak to him. And by the time I read the beginning of the book, which has some interesting exercises about using the cards and beginning to kind of open that dialogue with them. But thankfully, I then quit reading the book because the more I used those cards, and I am a fairy kind of a junkie, so this is kind of right up my alley. And so the more I used these cards, the more I came to my own understanding of what they meant. And then later, like I've recommended in other videos, I went back and started rereading as I was doing readings, the book meanings. Wow, some of them were radically different than what I had already come to for those cards to mean. And does that mean that I was wrong? No. Is there a way to bring both visions together? Sometimes. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes I just kind of throw out what the original creator says, and you should feel empowered to do that. Sometimes we give away our power by saying, I'm doing it wrong, I'm not doing it right. Tarot and oracle reading is not about that. So throw out those ideas. Give yourself more permission to make those decisions, right down to cutting and writing on your own darn cards if that's what's going to make them your best tools. Okay, thanks for joining me. I hope this gives you a lot of information about tarot and oracle decks, and I will see you next time here at Destination Unknown.